My Patreon member lives in northwestern England, and its current terminal subclade is I-FTC14092, which according to family tree DNA age estimates dates to around 1704 CE. My Patreon member has one subclade match at this branch who also shares the same surname as himself and also has patrilineal origins in that northwestern England region. Based on some autosomal DNA research that my Patreon member has completed, he thinks that his patrilineal line diverges apart from this match sometime around the mid-1700s, so not too far off from family tree DNA's age estimate. Now, the parent branch, I-FTC13233, is very interesting. This branch dates to around 1258 CE, according to family tree DNA age estimates, and one of the subclade matches has the same surname as my Patreon member. This is really cool because it infers that my Patreon member's patrilineal forefathers have had the same surname since at least the 13th century. Furthermore, this subclade match with the same surname from the 13th century also has patrilineal origins in the northwestern England region. Additionally interesting is that my Patreon member has a habitational surname, meaning his last name correlates to an actual town in England. And this town is in the Greater Manchester region of England, which is shaded in red in the following map, and is only 18 miles away from where my Patreon member lives today. So his patrilineal forefathers have been in the same general vicinity of England for at least around 750 years, which is pretty cool. I did some online research regarding this town in England that has the same surname as my Patreon member. And according to Wikipedia, it grew around this church in the 13th century, which is exactly when this patrilineal divergence occurred between my Patreon member and this other subclade match with the same surname from the 13th century. So it's really neat, and you don't see this every day, where someone can actually trace the exact origins of where their patrilineal forefathers were over 750 years ago. The most logical explanation to me is that this common patrilineal ancestor from the 13th century was living in this town when surnames became mandatory and just adopted a habitational surname from where he was from. How the patrilineal forefathers of my Patreon member reached that area of northwestern England by the 13th century will be the focus of the remainder of this video. Now, unfortunately, my Patreon member does not have any close ancient DNA matches. He has two ancient DNA matches that diverged apart from him with the IY18238 subclade, which is pretty old, dating to around 589 BCE, according to family tree DNA age estimates. But I'm going to include both of these ancient DNA samples in this video because I think they're telling regarding the narrative of how his forefathers reached England. The first ancient DNA connection comes from the 2020 study, Population Genomics of the Viking World. In the family tree DNA database, the sample is labeled Salme 2-W, also known as VK496. He lived sometime between 700 and 800 CE. He was discovered in Salme, Saaremaa, Estonia. He was part of the Viking double ship burial. Saaremaa is an island in the Baltic Sea off the coast of mainland Estonia. To quote the supplemental information from the study, quote, isotopes value in human dental enamel and bones show that the warriors buried in the mass graves in the ships came from central Sweden, end quote. The next distant ancient DNA connection comes from the 2022 study, the Anglo-Saxon Migration, and the formation of the early English gene pool. In the family tree DNA database, the sample is labeled Schleswig 8, also known as SWG008. He lived sometime between 1120 and 1160 CE. He was discovered in Schleswig, Rathausmarkt, Schleswig-Holstein, Germany. This location is the red diamond in the southern Jutland Peninsula in the following map of ancient DNA samples from the study. In regards to this location, to quote the supplemental information from the study, quote, its history is intrinsically tied to the prosperous Viking trading center Hathabu, 8th century to 1066 CE, end quote. So even though my Patreon member has a very distant connection to these two ancient DNA samples from the beginning of the Iron Age, I find it quite interesting that both samples have an association with Vikings and the Viking Age. What more can we learn from my Patreon members' subclade IY18238, which dates to the start of the Iron Age? Well, it has 8 child subclades, and 6 of those 8 child clades have modern testers that claim Sweden for their earliest known patrilo country of origin. Only one of the child clades has a modern tester claiming Denmark, and that's the same branch that has the ancient DNA connection from Schleswig. So based on this data, I find it highly probable that my Patreon members' patrilineal forefathers were living in modern-day Sweden at the start of the Iron Age. Furthermore, my Patreon members' one subclade match at the IBY69819 branch, which dates to around 263 CE according to family tree DNA age estimates, claims Sweden for their earliest known patrilineal country of origin. So I find it highly probable that my Patreon members' patrilineal forefathers were still living in modern Sweden during the start of the current era. Now, there is around 1,000-year time gap of missing data between this branch and when my Patreon members' patrilineal forefathers show up in the greater Manchester region of England in the 13th century. So the following is going to be speculative, but I think based on the aforementioned data I just talked about, the most likely explanation for how his patrilineal forefathers reach greater Manchester, England, would be with Vikings from the Viking Age. I also want to add that my Patreon members' one subclade match from the current era that claims Sweden for their earliest known patrilineal country of origin claims specifically the city of Malmo in Skane, southwestern Sweden, which is very close to Denmark. This area of southwestern Sweden was actually under control of the Danes during the Viking Age. So one possible theory is that this Swedish patrilineal forefather hitched a ride with the Danish Vikings westward and arrived in Danelaw, England. Greater Manchester is situated in the region of Danelaw, England, in the following map. That being said, though, because Greater Manchester is not too far from the Irish Sea in northwestern England, I also think it's possible that my Patreon members' patrilineal forefathers could have also hitched a ride with the Norse Vikings and have entered the region with them as well. I think both are possible, but if I had to lean towards one, I would lean with going with the Danes. That being said, though, I do not believe he was a Dane himself, but rather became associated with the Danes and joined Danish Viking migrations westward. But that being said, parts of Sweden were also connected with the Norse, and his Swedish patrilineal forefathers could have also accompanied the Norse Vikings to that region of England as well. Recently, a new preprint was released titled Steppe Ancestry in Western Eurasia and the Spread of the Germanic Languages. This preprint had a lot of interesting information regarding the origins of the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes, and also Viking migrations into the British Isles. To quote the preprint, quote, "By the Viking Age, we detect Eastern Scandinavian and Western Scandinavian ancestries across Britain and its islands, representing Viking migrations from Sweden and Norway. Although migration from Denmark is likely during this period, the close relation between the Anglo-Saxons and the Danish Vikings limits our ability to detect this migration." End quote. I believe that my Patreon member's forefather was one of these Eastern Scandinavian individuals from Sweden mentioned by the authors of this preprint that entered Britain during the Viking Age. This individual might have been absorbed into Danish culture. He might even accompanied the Danes westward during the Viking Age to Britain, but I do not believe he was a Dane himself because the Danes are more closely related to the Anglo-Saxons. They have Southern Scandinavian DNA as opposed to Eastern Scandinavian DNA associated with Sweden. What else can we learn from the STR data for my Patreon member? Well, he has a really fast STR mutation rate. Just in the first 12 STRs alone for Y12, I counted STR mutations at 6 different STRs. So half of them. And one of them was a 2-step mutation, making a genetic distance of 7 just at Y12 alone. You can see how this is problematic when the STR matching thresholds that FTDNA uses is 1 for Y12, 2 for Y25, 4 for Y37, and 7 for Y67. He only has one match at the Y25, Y37, Y67, and Y111. And that is his subclade match for the I-FTC14092 branch. He only has 6 Y12 matches, and they all connect to him with the I-FTC13233 subclade or sooner. So unfortunately, there are no promising leads, no STR matches that connect to him prior to the 13th century. Thanks for watching.